Mrs. Johnson quickly noticed something was off about her horse, Daisy. She acted different than usual, restless and uneasy. Mrs. Johnson had seen this behaviour before, but only with labouring horses, which was strange as Daisy never showed any signs of being pregnant. But as Daisy's behaviour only got worse, it became clear she was, in fact, in labour. Welcome to Wonderbot Animals. Everyone was shocked when the foal was finally born, but not for the reason you might think. After one final push, the foal's head and front legs finally came out. Soon after, followed the rest of the body, Daisy licked her foal clean and seemed content with everything that happened. But around her was complete silence. Everyone looked at the foal in complete shock. No one expected it to look like this. The veterinarian, Dr. Thompson, had a pale look on his face. He hadn't said anything to the Johnson family yet. He just quietly packed up his things. "Dr. Thompson?" Mrs. Johnson carefully asked. "Do you have an explanation for this?" But all he could do was mumble. "What was going on?" I'm sorry," the veterinarian began. "I'm sorry, but this isn't a foal." Mrs. Johnson was dumbfounded. Not a foal, she thought. What else can it be? But what was going on with Daisy's foal? Why was the veterinarian acting so strangely? And how did Daisy get pregnant in the first place? In a small town nestled deep in the countryside, there was a humble farm owned by the Johnson family. The Johnson family had been running their farm for generations, and they were known in the community for their love and care for their animals, particularly for their prized mare Daisy. Daisy was a beautiful black horse with a gentle character, and she was adored by everyone in the town. She had never been used for breeding, as the Johnsons primarily kept her as a companion animal. So it came as a great surprise one spring morning when they noticed Daisy acting strangely. She was pacing back and forth in her stall, whinnying and stomping her hooves on the ground, showing clear signs of distress. Mrs. Johnson, an experienced horsewoman, had seen this behaviour before and suspected that Daisy might be in labour, which was very unusual as she hadn't shown any signs of being pregnant. The Johnsons immediately called the local veterinarian, Dr. Thompson, who rushed to the farm as fast as he could. He had been the Johnsons' trusted vet for many years, and he knew Daisy well. When he arrived, he was greeted by an anxious Mr. Johnson, who led him to Daisy's stall. Dr. Thompson arrived at Daisy's stall and quickly assessed her condition. He could tell she was in labour and that the foal's arrival was imminent. Mrs. Johnson was baffled. No stallion had been in the same stall or even the same meadow as Daisy, so how could she have fallen pregnant? But she soon realised that was the least of her problems because Daisy was about to give birth and she needed all the help she could get. Luckily, Dr. Thompson had brought all the necessary equipment and prepared everything for when he had to use them. But first, Daisy had to try on her own. Dr. Thompson stated Daisy was only in the first stage of her labouring process. It could take a few hours up to a day for active labour to start, so all they could do was wait. But Mrs. Johnson wasn't one to sit still. She had to know who impregnated Daisy. Maybe that could tell her more about the foal. They had hung cameras around the farm after another incident that took place many years before, so all Mrs. Johnson had to do was watch back the footage. And so she did. She scanned through the footage, roughly back to where Daisy was supposedly impregnated. It wasn't long before Mrs. Johnson noticed something very strange. As she reviewed the footage, Mrs. Johnson's eyes widened in shock. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. On the night Daisy had supposedly been impregnated, she had been alone in her stall, but she saw something extraordinary on the video. Someone opened the gate and a stallion walked in. Mrs. Johnson immediately knew this was a premeditated act. But who would do something like this? And why? What were they getting out of it? She called her husband and Dr. Thompson, and they gathered around the computer screen to watch the baffling footage together. But then she suddenly recognized the stallion. It was their neighbor's stallion, Rocky. Mrs. Johnson had noticed Rocky acting strangely a few weeks before, but she had never imagined he would be the culprit behind Daisy's pregnancy. But when she looked closer, she noticed a woman had opened Daisy's stall for Rocky, which was strange as Rocky's owner was a widowed man. This raised only more questions, but Mrs. Johnson had no time to dwell as Dr. Thompson called her, saying Daisy was now in active labour. Mrs. Johnson quickly rushed back to Daisy's stall and saw her lying on the ground in distress. "It won't be long now," Dr. Thompson said with a smile on his face. You could see Daisy's abdominal muscles visibly contracting and relaxing, indicating she was experiencing strong rhythmic contractions. But Daisy didn't stay down on the ground. Instead, she rolled around, got up, paced around the stall, and lay down again. She looked very restless, but that would be over soon, or so they hoped. Daisy was breathing very heavily, and Mrs. Johnson worried about her precious horse. But Dr. Thompson assured her everything would be fine. Mrs. Johnson knew she had to trust her vet, but she couldn't ignore Daisy's behaviour. Sweat dripped down the mare's face and her eyes stood wide with concern. Even though Dr. Thompson was the veterinarian, Mrs. Johnson knew her horse through thick and thin. So when she got the feeling something wasn't right, she didn't just ignore it. She told Dr. Thompson again something was wrong, but his response stayed the same. That's when Mrs. Johnson knew she had to do something. She looked at her husband and he could see his wife's worry. But what could they do? Dr. Thompson was at Daisy's side all the time. Then Mr. Johnson suddenly knew what he had to do. He took a few steps backward, though he knew something was behind him and tripped on purpose. Mrs. Johnson and Dr. Thompson gasped as they heard Mr. Johnson fall. He screamed in pain, but it didn't hurt that much. He exaggerated to get Dr. Thompson's attention, and it worked because Dr. Thompson immediately rushed over to Mr. Johnson and helped him to his feet. But that wasn't enough. Mr. Johnson held his hand by his head and moaned in pain. "My head, it hurts. I have to lie down," he said sickly. "Dr. Thompson, can you help me inside?" Dr. Thompson, who stood by his side holding his arm, couldn't say no. He looked at Mrs. Johnson in an attempt for her to say, "I'll do it," but she stayed silent. "I'll be back in a second. Keep a close eye on Daisy and don't get too close," Dr. Thompson said when he and Mr. Johnson stumbled away. But Mrs. Johnson wasn't going to listen. She knew what her horse needed, and that was a loving touch, so she carefully stepped inside Daisy's stall. Daisy's breathing immediately calmed down a bit when Mrs. Johnson placed her hand softly on her back. She stroked the horse's back and gently reassured her that everything would be all right. Mrs. Johnson then looked underneath Daisy's tail and could see her foal was almost due. But there was something wrong. Daisy had been in labour for a very long time, and the foal should have been here by now. Mrs. Johnson looked as Daisy tried to push and finally realised what was going on. The foal lay breeched. This was very, very bad and wouldn't solve itself. They had to help Daisy, or else it could end badly for both of them. Dr. Thompson returned soon after, and Mrs. Johnson immediately explained what she had seen. The vet realised the seriousness of the situation and finally caved. He agreed with Mrs. Johnson. They had to help the foal get into a better position, and quickly too. Every minute counted. Dr. Thompson quickly called for additional veterinary assistance as the situation required immediate attention. Soon, a team of veterinarians arrived at the farm to assist in the complicated birth. Dr. Thompson and his team of veterinary specialists worked tirelessly, using all of their expertise and equipment to assist Daisy with her delivery. They carefully assessed the position of the foal and concurred it was presenting in a breech position, which meant that it was coming out with its behind first instead of head first. This was a complicated situation that required immediate attention, as it could lead to complications and endanger both Daisy and the foal. With focused precision, Dr. Thompson and his team carefully manoeuvred the breech foal into the correct position for delivery. They worked with gentle but firm movements, ensuring that the foal's legs were positioned properly to minimize the risk of injury to Daisy or the foal. It was a delicate and challenging process that required quick thinking and skilled hands. Meanwhile, Mrs. Johnson helplessly watched from the sideline. She felt horrible watching her beloved horse suffer like that. She knew pregnancy and labor had their risks, but this was unlike any other labor she had ever witnessed. She felt resentment for the person who did this to her dear Daisy. She decided since she couldn't assist with the birth, she would go to her neighbor's farm and confront him with the footage. She angrily knocked on his door, and he quickly opened the door. "Mrs. Johnson, what's the matter? I was just eating dinner." "Your dinner can wait. What have you done to Daisy?" Her neighbor, Philip, looked at Mrs. Johnson with a confused expression. "I have no idea what you are talking about," he said while frowning. "Well, I'll show you," Mrs. Johnson said, determined. She walked through the door and put her laptop on the table. "Please, explain this, Philip." And she pressed play. Philip was stunned. That was his stallion on the footage, but he had nothing to do with it. He tried to tell Mrs. Johnson that, but she was blind with anger. So Philip looked at the footage again, and this time he saw something. "Wait," he suddenly said. "I know whose hand that is." But instead of explaining himself, Philip stayed quiet. "Well?" Mrs. Johnson asked. "Whose hand is it? Who is the woman?" Philip looked sad, as if he didn't want to tell the truth anymore. It's my daughter," he quietly said. "I don't know why, but my daughter put Rocky in Daisy's stall." Mrs. Johnson was just about to ask more, but she suddenly got a call. It was Dr. Thompson. The foal could come at any moment, so she quickly rushed back to her farm, Philip following after her. "Where have you been?" Dr. Thompson asked. "Daisy is losing a lot of blood. The foal needs to come out immediately." The little hooves of the foal were already sticking out, but Daisy was exhausted from the long labor. She didn't have enough strength left to push on her own. So, Dr. Thompson put a special chain around the foal's hooves to help Daisy. He watched her belly closely, and with every contraction, he gently pulled. It was a very stressful moment for everyone. Sweat dripped down Dr. Thompson's forehead as he gently pulled again with the next contraction. It finally looked like it was going in the right direction. The foal came out bit by bit, and Daisy seemed to be doing good, considering the circumstances. "All right, one more push, Daisy," Dr. Thompson yelled. He braced himself for the final pull, and with that, the foal plunged to the ground. Everyone sighed in relief. But that changed quickly as the foal didn't move. Mrs. Johnson felt a lump form in her throat as she watched Daisy lick the foal. Those first minutes felt like an eternity. No one could take their eyes off the foal, who still hadn't moved. Mrs. Johnson was about to walk away when she saw a little movement, and that little movement got bigger and bigger, and suddenly the foal tried to get up. Mrs. Johnson hugged Dr. Thompson in relief, but not everyone had a big smile on their face. Dr. Thompson looked rather pale, actually. "What are you thinking, Doctor?" Mrs. Johnson asked worriedly. "That's not a regular foal," he carefully said. Mrs. Johnson frowned, but when she looked closer, she had to admit the foal looked very different from its parents. "What's wrong with it?" she asked the veterinarian. But before he had time to answer, Mrs. Johnson heard a car pulling up her driveway. Who could this be? Suddenly, Philip walked toward the front of the house and everything clicked. He had called his daughter "you," Mrs. Johnson yelled at the woman when she walked up to the stall. "You did this to my Daisy." "All right, calm down," Dr. Thompson said, trying to defuse the situation. "Who is this?" "I'm Philip's daughter, Tilly," the woman said. "She's the one who put Rocky together with Daisy," Mrs. Johnson yelled again. Tilly sighed. "Yes, I did it, but I'm not proud of it. I was in need of money, and knowing Rocky's parents, I figured this could make me a quick buck." Mrs. Johnson couldn't believe what she was hearing. "And how were you supposed to do that?" "Daisy is my horse, so how would you make any money from this?" Tilly looked at the ground and fiddled nervously with her fingers. "All right, well, my dad doesn't know this, but I did a DNA test on Rocky. We had adopted him long ago without knowing what breed he was, and I was very curious. When the test results came back, I was shocked. Rocky wasn't just a regular horse, he was a nabstrupper, a rare horse breed worth a lot of money. Knowing this and being in a difficult situation myself, I knew this could make me a lot of money. But I loved Rocky too much. I couldn't just sell him, so I let him impregnate Daisy. It was a foolish plan, and I realized that as soon as it was too late to do anything about it. I wanted to steal the foal as soon as it was born, but I knew that wouldn't work. I'm so sorry. I checked on Daisy many times to see how she was doing because I was feeling so guilty. I'm not going to report this to the police, Tilly, Mrs. Johnson eventually said. Everyone was confused about her sudden change of heart. She had been so angry only minutes ago. This has been a very stressful day for everyone, and it could have ended very badly, but it didn't. But I am going to ask you to leave my property and never return, she said with a firm voice. Tilly nodded. She understood why Mrs. Johnson would ask this from her. She had damaged their trust for her own selfish reason. So, without any argument, Tilly turned around and walked away. Daisy and her foal made a full recovery. Mrs. Johnson named the foal Dorothy, meaning God's gift, in Greek, and she would sometime let Rocky graze with them in the meadow. Mrs. Johnson never sold Daisy or Dorothy, as she wasn't interested in the money. They lived a long and happy life together.